We're always covering the best champions for every single patch, but let's flip the switch for this one and break down 10 of the worst champions for Season 13. Keep in mind that even though we rate these champions very low, that doesn't mean you can't climb with them. The main difference between an OP and a terrible champion is how much effort it takes to see results. With OP picks, you don't even need to be proficient and can just win games due to the champion's power level. On the other hand, with weaker picks, if you don't play the game perfectly, then you're much more limited in what you can contribute. If you want to play one of these weak picks, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just going to take more time and more willpower to make them work. And if you didn't know, the preseason is arguably the best time to get way better at League of Legends. The reason is because when you focus on improving your own skills instead of just doing whatever it takes to scrape a win, you do tend to lose a little more in the short term in exchange for huge gains in the long term. So if you're thinking of mastering your macro skills and not joining every team fight, but instead trying to learn how to become a split-pushing god, or if you're looking to learn a new role or bootcamp your mechanics, then enroll to our world-class courses as we teach every fundamental you could ever need with the world's largest premium library for League of Legends. And better yet, if you join SkillCapped for the long haul, then for just $6.99 a month, you can get a 1-year membership to SkillCapped. And if you don't climb at least 5 divisions while actively using SkillCapped, you can claim a full refund, so there's no risk. This subscription also grants you access to WoW Dragonflight, Valorant, and Wrath of the Lich King. So check us out right after this, link in the description below. And with that said, let's move on to today's guide. Starting off in the top lane, our first pick is going to be Sion. Sion is getting obliterated by many of the meta top laners and is struggling to find any footing. Sion is currently winning less than 45% of the time into the likes of Fiora, Mundo, Darius, and Aatrox, who are extremely popular right now. Fiora and Aatrox are especially bad as their mobility makes it super difficult for Sion to ever land a Q, greatly limiting damage potential. If there were just 1 or 2 champions Sion had a more difficult time against, then things would be fine, as you could just ban that champion out. The fact that there are multiple champs that Sion plays poorly into makes it really hard to find consistent success on him. There's simply no reason to pick Sion when you have tanks like Mundo and K'Sante being incredibly strong at the moment. A top laner you want to avoid even more than Sion for Season 13 is Akali. Mid lane is definitely much better suited for Akali right now, as she's performing abysmal as a top laner. Being a squishy assassin who needs to snowball to be effective makes Akali top way more coin flip than the majority of top laners. When you're playing Akali mid and laning against squishy champs, finding solo kills and extending leads is not all that difficult. Top lane is a whole different story though. When you have these tanks like Mundo and K'Sante being played who can just stack magic resist and nullify your kill power, it's very hard to succeed. If you end up going even in lane against a Mundo, Fiora, Gangplank, or K'Sante, then you've actually lost lane, as they're going to heavily outscale you the longer the game lasts. The stat lines for Akali are even uglier than Sion's as well. Akali is winning less than 44% of the time against Fiora, K'Sante, Darius, and Mundo, who are heavily prioritized in the meta. It takes way more effort to see consistent results with Akali compared to the majority of meta top laners, so we would advise staying away for the start of Season 13. Next up on the list is going to be Zed Jungle. Zed mid lane is still in a pretty good spot, but Zed Jungle has been torn down more heavily by recent nerfs. Zed's clear speed has become substantially weaker, as he not only lost damage on Q and E, but also from the cleave damage being lowered on Tiamat. These nerfs resulted in about a 4% cut to Zed Jungle's solo Q win rate, which is quite massive. Another big factor limiting Zed's power as a jungler is the fact Sylas has come into meta as a highly contested jungler. Zed is winning less than 45% of the time in the Sylas matchup, which is obviously a pretty terrible stat line. If you want to play an AD assassin jungler, then Kha'Zix is definitely the better option now that Zed has fallen off. Very much like Zed, Lee Sin's power level was being propped up by the fact Ravenous Hydra was so OP, but now that it's been nerfed 3 times, Lee is starting to feel the pain. In a jungle meta where full clearing has become more optimal, Lee Sin is finding a much more difficult time fitting in. Jungle Treat Gold has been nerfed twice now as well, so it's really nullifying the power of these early game reliant junglers. Playing Lee is pretty coin flip at the moment because you can try to gank early on and snowball your lanes, but if you don't execute, the game is basically over. If you're playing against a jungler who full clears and you end up not getting anything out of your gank, then you fall so far behind in tempo. Unless you're in the higher brackets of play where your team will more reliably win off early game advantages, it makes no sense to pick Lee over a jungler like Mordekaiser. Mord just sits back, full clears, scales super well, and takes way less skill to pull off. The risk is simply not worth the reward of picking Lee Sin, so he's a jungler we would recommend you drop from your champion pool for the start of Season 13. It feels like this champion can never escape the depths of D tier for solo queue, as Azir is for yet another season one of the worst mid laners. As a champion with such a high skill ceiling, Azir is extremely difficult for Riot to balance. Whenever Azir even comes close to a 50% win rate in solo queue, he is a definitive pick or ban champ for pro. Pro players that can push Azir to his limits can turn the champion into a top tier pick, but for the majority of solo queue players, this is not attainable. Most solo queue Azir players are only able to pilot him at an average or below average level, and in that case, he's not worth playing over 99% of mid laners. The fact Azir does not have any reliable crowd control or catch tool in his kit makes him an even more volatile pick. If your positioning and mechanics are not on point, then Azir just becomes a walking cannon minion for enemy assassins to feast on. So what it comes down to with Azir is, are you willing to spend countless games of hardship to reap the rewards of mastering the champion? If you're not going to dedicate a ton of time to Azir, then don't even bother playing him, as there are so many easier to execute and stronger mids to choose from. Suffering from many of the same issues that plagued Azir, Ryze is our second worst mid laner for Season 13. We were optimistic that the reintroduction of Rod of Ages would help propel Ryze back into a viable spot, but it hasn't played out that way. Analytically speaking, Rod is performing even worse than ever Frost on Ryze, so item changes have not been positive for the champ. Similar to Azir, Ryze is one of those champions that in the hands of a mastered player becomes 10 times more effective. Fun fact here is that Ryze hasn't been a 50% win rate champion for over 5 years, which is a pretty incredible stat. Ryze is so difficult to balance for solo queue, as a 46% win rate Ryze can still be a pick or ban champion in pro. For that reason, Riot always has to keep Ryze in a weaker state for solo queue. If Ryze were to become a top tier solo queue mid in his current state, he would be a 100% presence champion in pro without question. Proper spacing is more important on Ryze than most mid laners, and the majority of players just can't space well enough. As a shorter range mage, Ryze is way more vulnerable than most mages, and with all the catch and long range control power in the game these days, it's so easy to punish an average Ryze player. Ryze also doesn't have that one big spell he can use for instant AoE impact. You need to be up front, dealing consistent DPS to be effective, which makes Ryze difficult for the average mid laner. Moving on to AD carry, there aren't a ton of terribly weak champions in the role at the moment, but Kalista is one of them. For Diamond and above, Kalista isn't actually that bad of an ADC, but for the majority of ranks, she's not worth the time. Kalista requires much more coordination than most ADCs in order for you to get the most out of her. For example, Kalista's W passive damage only triggers when you and your support are attacking the same champion. Kalista's ultimate is often difficult for solo queue supports to use optimally, and another tool that they have to worry about on top of their own spells. Being a champion who relies so heavily on winning lane to be more impactful than the enemy ADC makes Kalista a very risky pick. If the game goes to 3 items and you're even with the enemy ADC, it's very likely you're not going to be as effective in team fights as they will. For solo queue, if a champion needs very specific stars to be aligned in order for them to find success, it probably means they aren't the most optimal pick, which is the case for Kalista. Now that Zarya has been buffed and is no longer the worst ADC, taking her crown as one of the marksmen you want to avoid is Aphelios. Aphelios falls into that same category as Ryze and Azir, where he can never be a 50% win rate solo queue champion without being a pick or ban in pro. You have to go all the way back to January of 2020 when Aphelios last had a win rate just slightly above 50%. This past season had been especially bad, with Aphelios' win rate never peaking above 46%. In the right hands and in a coordinated environment, Aphelios has so much potential, as his kit is extremely unique. Being able to go from a strong, consistent DPS duelist to a long-range sniper in an instant is something no other ADC can achieve. This constant gun swapping and correct optimization of guns takes a while to get used to, which doesn't make Aphelios very friendly for the average player. Can you make Aphelios work? Sure. Are you putting yourself at an unnecessary disadvantage by playing him? Yes. More commonly seen as a top laner these days, but originally designed as a support, Tahm Kench is an absolute disaster of a support. Tahm is a really weird champion because he does a lot of things okay, but doesn't excel at anything. For example, Tahm has the slow from Q and knock up from W, but it's not super easy to land, and it's not a very powerful chain CC combo. On the other hand, someone like Maokai has point and click lockdown with chain CC potential, so if you want to play an aggressive melee support, why pick Tahm instead of Maokai? With Tahm's ultimate, he has the ability to protect one of his teammates, but if you want a support who can peel for their carries, why not just play Lulu, who can also buff up their ADC at the same time? Tahm's fallen into some sort of identity crisis, where Riot doesn't know if they want him to be a support who dives in for aggressive engage plays or sits back to protect his carries. This can be fine when piloted by high-level players, but for the average solo queue support, not having a clear idea of how you should be playing is just unnecessary fog. With Janna, it's plain and simple. Just sit back and protect your carries from dive champions. With Amumu, you're looking for those angles where you can dive in and hit a nice multi-man ultimate. As for Tahm, it's never as cut and dry, so he takes way more brain power to make work than the majority of supports. Once one of the most reliable melee supports you could play, Braum has lost his touch over the past while. When you take a look at the highest win rate melee supports right now, we see Amumu, Maokai, Blitzcrank, and Pyke. One thing all these champions have that Braum doesn't is the ability to deal a considerable amount of damage. Braum just lacks the ability to single out targets and chunk them for a large portion of their health bar. Not only can Amumu chain CC the enemy for multiple seconds, but he can nearly 100-0 an enemy squishy with his full combo. Braum can't even reliably chain CC someone unless his teammates help him out, which is not a recipe for success in solo queue. It goes back to what we were talking about for Tahm Kench, where Braum has decent peel power and decent CC, but doesn't excel at either. If you want to have success with a melee support in solo queue, then playing someone with that instant catch power is proving to be way more effective. The only time we'd really recommend you play Braum is if you can duo up and be on the same page as your ADC. Jumping onto minions with Braum W and finding engages onto the enemy that way can be very powerful, but it's way harder to coordinate than just hitting a hook with Blitz. Alright guys, before we wrap this up, let's tell you a little more about SkillCapped. So, we offer a 5-division rank up guarantee, and think that's a pretty crazy thing to offer. It's like a gym membership guaranteeing you'll get ripped. Your local gym would go bust if they offered that, right? Not us. We've offered this for years because our service really does work. It works so well, in fact, that we're able to produce by far the largest catalog of premium league guides on the internet. We add over 20 videos a week, with over 1,600 guides curated into over 100 courses no one can compare. We've also sent challenger players into ELO Hell 714 times and counting, where they commentate how to carry live. They also respond to all questions asked. Sign up today for as little as $6.99 a month if you are serious about improving. So, do you guys agree with our top 10, or would your list have looked a little different? Be sure to let us know down in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching, good luck on the Rift, and we will see you in the next one.